Well, first again, thank you so much to all of you for coming and for your enthusiasm, and for all of those volunteers who cooked the incredible meal that we had, of which I definitely approve. I was asked if I approved, and yes, I do. It was fantastic, so well done. Again, give a round of applause to all of us. And so what, as you heard, what I'll be speaking about specifically tonight is this book, The Gaza Kitchen, and sort of, how it came about, what it entails, what it tells us about Gaza and the Palestinian situation more broadly. And then if you're interested in kind of learning about, specifically about last year's assault and about Gaza more generally, from a political perspective, I'll be doing that tomorrow. But I'm happy to entertain all questions in the Q&A. But just due to time, I'll be focusing on this. So I don't want to take forever. I know everyone's probably full and ready to kind of doze off at this point, so I'll try not to bore you too much. And if I do go too fast, like someone raise their hand, because I have a tendency to go really quickly. So yeah, the book is called The Gaza Kitchen, A Palestinian Culinary Journey, and it was, it took, about 3 years in the making, and it was my co-author Maggie Schmidt and myself who, I had always had this idea of wanting to have a book that was sort of something that was at the intersection of food and politics. So something that could document or codify Palestinian culinary heritage, specifically that of the Gaza region from which I hail, but that also could use food as a lens to kind of explore Palestinian history, past and present, and be able to share that with the world. There's a kind of a window to the world. But it, so it was always kind of a labor of love for me. But then when Maggie, who's been a long time supporter of all sorts of issues of social justice and had been to Gaza with a group, and she at that time was a food writer and was also interested in a similar idea, I thought it would be great to have kind of a partner in crime to take this project on. And so we embarked on this 3-year-long project. It took us, obviously, as you all know, it's very hard to get into Gaza, even for me as a Palestinian national. So it took us a while to get there and to kind of collect this, all this information. And I'll talk a little bit about that process. And then, of course, sift through the data and organize it and lay it out. And we just did this ourselves, which, as we learned later, is quite highly unusual for a cookbook. So we did the photographs and the writing and the interviews. And then we finally found our wonderful publisher, Just World Books, who supported us and took us on. But in any case, so this all started in 2010, and then the very first drafts were published in around 2012 or 13, and we're updating it now at the moment and adding many more recipes and so on. But the book basically weaves together recipes. I don't know if anyone has had a chance to go through it or not, but it weaves together recipes, portraits or profiles of individuals, largely of women, but of others as well, of agronomists and farmers and so on, as well as political and economic analysis. It kind of gives you all of that in one package, using food as kind of the narrative device. And what we usually like to say is, these are the sorts of images that we are accustomed to seeing when it comes to the situation in Gaza, or what we imagine, at least in America. I don't know how it is here, but they're very anonymous images that are shot from above, from afar. Very caricatured images of what life is like, right? Just bombed out buildings, and of course, this is obviously a very important part of the picture, but it doesn't help you understand the people or how they're impacted. It doesn't really humanize at all. So we kind of imagine zooming in, away from that picture, zooming in onto the street level, and going even further, can we imagine what life is like beyond those walls and into the houses, into the private domain of the kitchens, with which Maggie was quite fascinated, as you could see, and then obviously going beyond that to the people, and this was my son at the time, and I don't think we had this particular dessert. This is a fenugreek dessert that's hulba, that's very common in Palestine, especially for our new mothers. But anyway, so we sort of literally went around from I had kind of a master list of recipes I wanted to be able to document, but that really kind of just led us. It was a whole kind of can of worms that led us from one person to another, from one issue to another. How do people have access to certain ingredients, and how has that been impacted by the economic blockade, and has the food changed, and how has the restrictions on fishing zones impacted the availability of seafood, and on and on and on. So just backing up a tiny bit here, I sometimes get asked, why the focus on Gaza, or why specifically Gaza? Is there anything special about it? Or, for me, obviously, I'm very passionate about it. I'm from Gaza. But beyond that, I do like to kind of, note that Gaza is also a sort of archive of the Palestinian condition, a kind of key to understanding the Palestinian struggle as a whole. And the late Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish famously said that Gaza equals the history of an entire homeland. And what that means is really, again, it's so representative. It's kind of, a very, gross embodiment of all of kind of the awful things, awful Israeli policies towards the Palestinians are kind of all concentrated in Gaza. And so it's obviously part and parcel of the larger Palestinian struggle, but it is really very representative, and I think that's why. Talking from a very specific cuisine point of view, I always found the cuisine to be kind of really unique in a good way, and also because Gaza has kind of been isolated for so long, it's largely been unknown to a lot of the world, and even to other Palestinians, right? There's a lot of dishes with which Palestinians aren't familiar. Palestinian dishes from Gaza may not be familiar to other Palestinians, and they include a lot of ingredients and spices that you don't see being used in other parts of Palestine. And this has, largely to do with Gaza's position geographically along the crossroads between continents, and its historic significance as a trading city. And once upon a time, it was the main port along the Mediterranean. So there's a whole slew of reasons. It was a main stop along the spice route, that it might have absorbed all these various spices and inclination to use so much pepper. And my co-author always likes to point out that it's also a really interesting case study in postmodern colonialism, and how you kind of, because a lot of the media in 2005 was saying this was the year during which the Israeli government dismantled its settlements and its military infrastructure from within Gaza, in this process referred to as the disengagement. And a lot of the media was, applauding this as an end of the occupation, and this, bold move by Ariel Sharon, the then Israeli prime minister, when in reality it was simply a restructuring of the Israeli occupation, kind of a new phase, if you will, in which they continued to retain control over all of Gaza's markers of sovereignty, its airspace, its sea space, and its land, but just from afar. So while, absolving themselves of responsibility, saying, oh, but we no longer occupy, we're not responsible for Gaza or opening up its borders, but we'll continue to control it. So that's why we say, and we consider the occupation just another form of colonialism. That's why we say it is a study in how do states like Israel manage to continue their colonization of Palestinian land in this modern age, and it's done in this way when one studies Gaza. Just backing up a little bit, the area that we cover in the book, we refer to it, notice we don't say like the Gaza Strip or the cuisine of the Gaza Strip or whatever, we say the Gaza kitchen, and that was intentional because prior to 1948, and that was the year that we refer to as Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. It was the year that Zionist militias attacked and depopulated and ethnically cleansed hundreds of Palestinian villages and forced Palestinians from their homes, and they often were forced to flee to the nearest sort of cities or locations to them. And during that time, during British Mandate, historic Palestine was divided into sort of regions, right? Like, I guess similar to here, what you call shires or something. I think I have that right. So this area in the shaded area would have been known as the Gaza district, right? And then you would have had like the Haifa district in the north or whatever. And so many Palestinians who lived in this region fled to Gaza, and there was no white line demarcating a Gaza Strip. That didn't exist until, much later on. But very conveniently, the Israelis intended to force the population to seek refuge or migrate to that area, and then drew the borders around them, and then took over the land from which they fled, and then did not allow them to return to their places of origin. And the result is that most of the Palestinian population that lives in the modern day Gaza Strip is actually not from there. They're from towns and villages that you see here, shaded in green. And then here you have two more modern maps of what the Gaza Strip looks like. And I'll show you two. This one I think was taken in 2007 or so, and then this one, oh wait, you know what, I don't have the more modern, oh here, I'm sorry, this one was taken in 2010, and then this one much more recently, I think 2014 or something, and you can see this pink line, and that is the Israeli imposed buffer zone that has, encroached more and more over the years into Palestinian land. And half of Gaza's farmland is located along this area. And the result is that farmers and shepherds and so forth that attempt to get to their land are often shot at or killed. And this happened even protesters who go and protest either their inability to farm their land or, in solidarity with their brethren in the West Bank, for example, as happened 2 days ago, are very frequently shot because you can't even see. It's not like in the West Bank where you see the checkpoints right in front of you or you see the soldiers or whatever. It's a completely invisible occupation. So this border is lined with either electric fence or sniper towers with completely ambiguous, shoot to kill orders. So my point here being that the modern day Gaza Strip is probably the most surveilled, closed off area in the world, and add to that its population is one that is also besieged and largely refugees. So it's a stateless population without any sovereignty or control over any of their borders or airspace or sea space, and no control over access of those borders or ability to move freely in and out. And it's hard to convey that or explain what that means or imagine what it means when you're not able to leave or enter your town at will, right? So like I can't right now, even though I have Gaza residency, I can't get there. When this border is open down here, along with Egypt, which jointly with Israel has besieged Gaza, I would have to fly into Cairo and drive by land to the border and then wait to see if it's open. And it's only been open something like 15 days since last summer, if you can imagine, with 2 million people living in Gaza, half of them under the age of 18. So again, we're talking about an area that is very, very, very difficult to access and has very limited freedoms for the people and is very young, as you can see here and as I explained. And yet, despite all this, the population, we frequently hear about where's the Palestinian Gandhi, or why aren't Palestinians, non-violently resisting, blah, blah, blah. And, what I always respond is, well, they are on an everyday basis. There's a struggle not only to retain dignity, but, an insistence on surviving. And you see this, whether in the small private domain of the kitchen, the family household, through the farmers that insist on planting their trees over and over, despite them being demolished so many times. This is the everyday struggle and resistance of the Palestinians. I don't know how much time we have, but I sometimes like to show this, but I don't know how many people are coming tomorrow. I don't want to be redundant. No? No one is coming tomorrow. In that case, I'll show it. I don't know, do we have a plug for sound? The sound isn't necessary. I just want to show this. It's like 60 seconds long, and it's a little animated graphic that an Israeli human rights group made to kind of attempt to depict what we mean when we say Gaza is a closed zone. And I kind of like to show it because it really helps visualize the situation. Oops, I just skipped. Right. So back to the book. So we wanted to include all of this to try to explain, all of this that I've been talking about in terms of Gaza's, modern day closure, which is an extension of its long-term closure. Because what I point out to people is that Gaza has been subject to some sort of closure ever since the early 1990s and the implementation of the Oslo Accords. Very few people realize that with the Oslo Accords came the beginning of the closure in Gaza. There wasn't actually like any border closing off Gaza prior to the early 90s. We had much easier access to the West Bank and other parts of Palestine than we do now, where it's completely, sealed off. But also, really, what it did is begin to institutionalize the fragmentation of the Palestinian people and the isolation of the Palestinians from one another within Palestine and on the outside as well. So that continued, and it really came full circle, the closure, starting with the disengagement in 2005, and then now to the present with the full. So how do we explain all of that, convey that, along with, trying to kind of, provide a tribute to the spirit of the people and their ability to, their resilience and their insistence on survival, and, document all that. So as I mentioned, what we wanted to do, what was really important to me, especially as a Palestinian, was heritage documentation, codifying this knowledge, which, up until this has really been largely oral, right? So, your grandmother told your mother told you how to make romania, one of the dishes that you ate today, the eggplant and pomegranate stew. I wanted to codify that kind of as a document for Palestinians themselves, and then also for others as a means to understanding the situation. And then providing analysis of the situation, and you'll see in there bits and pieces about the situation with water, sustainability, the debate about sustainability, agricultural sustainability, and so on, profiles of the people, and then a lot of documentary photography. So you'll notice we don't have a lot of staged pictures of finished food dishes. We wanted kind of things in their natural setting. And we really wanted, again, to enter those intimate and ordinary spaces, the ordinary moments that are linked to those bigger political issues, as I said, because it's only when you have access to those private spaces that you begin to have those conversations with people, and suddenly they realize you're not there to just talk to them rather about rockets or the government or whatever. No, you want to learn how their grandmother made lentils, and then as you're talking about the lentils, suddenly it becomes clear that because of the border closure, they can't afford to buy olive oil anymore, and so they're substituting something else, and on and on and on. It's all kind of linked together. And so again, I talked about profiles. Some of those that we profiled were, of the older generation, of those who remember life prior to 1948 in their native villages. This woman, Ibrahim, taught us how to make traditional kishik stew, which is a fermented wheat and dairy. It was an ancient way of dairy preservation that's still popular throughout Central Asia and the Middle East, and she taught us how to make her village's traditional kishik stew. Told us about her father, who was mayor in their village of Betlin. We talked to women in the north of the Gaza Strip, the towns of Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun, which are traditional farming villages. We talked to, this is Imhana, that who was very fond of rearing rabbits on her rooftop. You see this a lot on rooftop gardens, and in any small patch of green, you'll see people kind of trying to be productive and make something out of that, to try to become self-sufficient as much as possible. We went to the south of Gaza, where they're well known for their maftoul, which is the Palestinian version of couscous. You had it tonight, but the grain that's made in Palestine is actually even smaller than this. This is a bit larger than what we would ordinarily use, but this is her hand rolling it, and we have other recipes featured by her. But it was incredible because as we learned after talking to her and speaking to others, southern Gaza is known to have matriarchal societies where the women kind of run the household and are in charge, and she oversees her farm, and she's originally a refugee from the town of Jaffa. But she was very unusual for refugees that came, was taught farming by her uncle. So she was able to kind of return to their line of work, which you don't really have, and was able to have access to land and become self-sufficient, and employs like 40 seasonal workers that pick chilies in her farm and so forth. And also, as I learned, she supervises in the kitchen and her husband does all the cooking. So it was really interesting. Yeah.
Wow.
I know. After a very long day, we were fasting. It was Ramadan. It was hot. The electricity was out. And there we had showed up for her to show us how to make maftoura. And we felt awfully rude and obnoxious. And then I kind of in the back of my mind, I said, well, where's your husband? He's resting. So in the back of my mind, I thought, oh God, it's the women always have it worse. It's like, here she is having to cook for me, and after having worked, and she's fasting. And then he suddenly showed up and started cooking, and I thought, well, what's going on? And she said, oh, why don't you think I cook? No, he does everything. I tell him what to do. So anyway, I thought, well, there you go. That's also kind of shattering the stereotypes, any stereotypes we might have about whatever. I was mentioning that somebody, I just came from Scotland, and they said, well, you're not what we thought at all. We thought we'd be getting a reserved and timid Palestinian woman or something. And I was like, no, they're not really known to be reserved and timid, Just in case you had any doubts. There you have Sultan showing you otherwise. We talked to farmers as well. In this case, Mohammed Sultan, here he's holding a branch of purslane. I don't know if anybody knows what that is.
Yep.
Yeah, in Arabic we call it betla, but apparently it's the most highly nutritious wild green available on the planet. It has more naturally occurring green-based omega-3s than anything else out there. But the point here is that he had lost all of his 500 acres of land and 50 beehives through Israeli farm demolition. And of course, they never show up and say, oh, we're going to pay for this or whatever, compensate you. But he was at a workshop run by, I think, a union for farmers, trying to kind of, see what his options were and try to learn what he could do. And the options, that he had was he could either replant his trees, and it would take them years to become fruitful again, his olive trees and his orchard. And in the meantime, he would have no source of income and be dependent on handouts. Or he could resort to horticulture. And that comes with its own sort of, problems, which is he would have to rely on the import of fertilizers and pesticides, both of which have been restricted due to the Israeli blockade. Or he could try cash cropping like strawberries, which the Dutch have, fervently lobbied the Israelis for, because they grow very well out of season in Gaza. But the problem is that they are basically like exporting water, because they're very water intensive in an area that's very deprived of water. So you can see there's all these really interesting issues that arise from the smallest such thing. And in the end, he decided to replant his orchard and his trees. But again, you would never know just by looking at him. He was really happily posing for us with all of his, other women that we met as well. Here showing us how to make a traditional spice blend called dugga, which is made from toasted wheat and caraway and lentils and highly nutritious again. Just us here doing some field work. And, due to the fact that Gaza's only power plant was bombed in 2006 and is now only partially operational, there's rotating and continuous power outages and now it's gotten particularly bad, and I'll explain why in a moment, but anywhere from 8 to 14 hours at a time, and you just won't have power. And it used to be that Palestinians were able to slightly overcome this by a complicated system of smuggling tunnels that they had built beneath the border with Egypt, and they would smuggle in fuel this way, and then they were able to at least partially compensate, and they would use electric generators as well. But now the Egyptians, you might have heard, are flooding these tunnels, and so the prices of fuel have risen again, and the outages have gotten worse. But this was us trying to photograph under those conditions. And then just a bit about the blockade, and then after I'll end with that, we can have some Q&A. Obviously, it was very important for us to be able to speak about the impact of the blockade and what it really means, because the common, I think the misunderstanding is that the blockade equals lack of food, right? Or that, somehow there's just no food in Gaza, or that's really the problem here. But in fact, it's sort of much more sinister than that. I want to say depraved, and it's a man-made catastrophe, and all of the humanitarian agencies we kept speaking to kept emphasizing this to us, that this is a man-made catastrophe, it should not be this way, and reminding us that Gaza historically is actually a very rich city, a city of merchants and traders, and we read throughout the textbooks about Gaza, and it was never a place that suffered from these sorts of things, and it's been deliberately impoverished and de-developed. And as we learned, and that particularly to be able to move about freely. All these sorts of things, that's what the blockade is about. And in fact, as we learned, what's known as the, oh, hang on, I'll get to that in a minute, I had it. But it's a difference between what might be available in the market and what in fact might be accessible to people. So just because there's certain foods being allowed in, and they are allowed in using this very strange formula that kind of calculates exactly how many calories you need, whatever, as a young male or something you might need, who knows, 2,000. So we'll count that there's this many young males and that times X number of calories required, and they'll allow in that amount of food, right? So things will come in. It may not be what you want. So we would go to different shops, and certain things would be available one week, they wouldn't be another. And we were told by the vendors they might provide the Israelis with a list of what they needed for their shop, and then they would allow in half of those things, and they would even throw in things that they didn't want. And we learned that it's all determined by Israeli market excesses and supplies, and it has nothing to do with what the Palestinians actually want. As by way of example, that particular year, we saw a lot of dried galangal root in the spice markets. And nobody knew what to do with this rhizome or what it was in Gaza. And we later learned there was a big Thai food craze in Israel. And then I guess when it died down, they didn't know what to do with all the excess galangal, so they dumped it on the Gaza market. Second and third tier grade, fruits and vegetables, those would be, again, exported to Gaza. So it was in fact the Israeli farmers' unions that were the most upset during the strictest years of the blockade, because they didn't have a market, a kitchen garden for all their excess stuff. So again, just because things might be available, it doesn't mean people can afford to buy them due to this long-term blockade that has resulted in mass aid dependence and impoverishment. Things have become prohibitively expensive, and purchasing power has dramatically decreased. And the result is, again, dependence on the galangal root in the spice markets. And nobody knew what to do with this rhizome or what it was in Gaza. And we later learned there was a big Thai food craze in Israel. And then I guess when it died down, they didn't know what to do with all the excess galangal, so they dumped it on the Gaza market. Second and third tier grade, fruits and vegetables, those would be, again, exported to Gaza. So it was in fact the Israeli farmers' unions that were the most upset during the strictest years of the blockade, because they didn't have a market, a kitchen garden for all their excess stuff. So again, just because things might be available, it doesn't mean people can afford to buy them due to this long-term blockade that has resulted in mass aid dependence and impoverishment. Things have become prohibitively expensive, and purchasing power has dramatically decreased. And the result is, again, dependence on the equivalent of food vouchers and coupons and things like this, where again, this is not necessary, and it can easily be resolved. That year, again, an Israeli human rights group insisted that the Israeli government reveal what the objective was of the blockade, and someone had leaked from the government that these were known as the tenets of the Israeli siege. No development, no prosperity, no humanitarian crisis. So in other words, you kind of want to keep Gaza on the brink, but you don't want things to get so bad, right, that it creates an international outcry. So yeah, look, we're going into Gaza, what's the problem? We shouldn't complain. But again, it's people are just surviving, but they're not living, they're not thriving. That's really the difference here. And I remember something that the UN field director at the time told me. He said, nobody's starving in Gaza, but everybody is hungry. And no one is really thriving or able to be productive, because the very things that the blockade targets, meaning the things that the Israelis prevent from entering, are the things that would allow factories to be built, like cement or components for factories, or even preventing people from leaving, right, to be able to go study in universities or communicate with the outside world or whatever. So there's a minimum transfer of foods and everything that is done targets the productive sector and prevents economic growth. So in each subsequent assault on Gaza, you find that there's a pattern whereby factories are targeted, whereby the agricultural infrastructure is completely decimated. It's not like it's just about let's kill as many people as possible. No, it's very, very deliberate. And you'll find that half of Gaza's farmland was in fact destroyed. You can see here, this is all farmland, either destroyed or completely destroyed. I don't think I had a chance to talk about the fishing zone, but you probably saw in that very early map that I have. Let me see if I can find it. What I was trying to say is that in the map that I had in the beginning, you could see here that off the coast of Gaza, well, here on the map, you see there's this white line. And what that represents is the Israeli-imposed naval blockade. So in the best of times, fishermen were supposed to be allowed to fish up to 20 nautical miles into sea, and that's based on the Oslo Accords. But in the and even that, of course, is a restriction from the international fishing limits of 200 miles. But in the worst of times, it's 3 nautical miles, which is what it is right now, and that really doesn't give you a whole lot of room to fish in, especially since it's around here that you have a deep sea trench that brings in all sorts of migratory species of fish from the Mediterranean. And so now the result is that everything you see in the markets is like, this small. So you're threatening future populations of fish, and you're not really getting a whole lot. So this is another problem, obviously, for the fishermen, and they'll be subject to all sorts of cruel and unusual punishment. Their nets are cut if they go beyond that boundary. They're imprisoned. Their boats are destroyed, and on and on. And I'll get in a moment. I'll say what people are doing, how they're coping. But yeah, I know humanitarian crisis. Obviously, there is a crisis. But the result is that 75 or 80% of the population is now dependent on food aid, meaning that without that aid, they would not be able to feed their families. But it should not be like this, obviously. It's not a natural thing for it to occur. And this, again, explaining what the siege or the sanctions are really about, in case we had any doubt, that it's not starvation. It's just kind of torture or collective punishment, right? The results here, and again, I'll talk more about this political stuff tomorrow, but that the result is that we forget, we don't even talk anymore about what this is really about. Everyone, keeps talking about, are they okay? Or is the situation okay in Gaza? Do they have enough food? Blah, blah, blah. But people forget to talk about the real issue, which is their rights and their freedom. That's what this is really about. Okay, so finally, I'll just end with how are people coping? And we've talked a lot about, this is really kind of the crux of the book. We wanted to highlight, this tenacious spirit of the Palestinian people. One of the main ways they were coping in Gaza, they were overcoming, these long-term restrictions and blockade, was by building this vast network of underground tunnels beneath the ground, through which they were smuggling everything from livestock to people to cars, and it's supply and demand, right? So the tunnels were never really necessary, or there was no demand for them, even though they might have existed prior to the imposition of the blockade. But once you kind of every means to you is shut off, then of course demand will rise, and it was this whole multi-million-dollar industry, and there was investments and profits and tunnel lords and all sorts of things, and everybody had a share of this. The Israelis, the Egyptians, but now the Egyptians see fit to completely shut those down, and of course they're blaming everything happening in Egypt on the Palestinians. So even this network has been shut down for Palestinians. Women are largely becoming, you see this more and more, the breadwinners of their families. This is one women's cooperative we visited in Gaza. And, in this case, this woman, Lulu Samoni, she supports 14 members of her and her brother's family. And they come and they cook together, and then they, either cater for parties or for working professionals or whatever. This we found to be really interesting. There was this whole debate going on about, we call it the debate about sustainability, about, okay, what should we do as a people? And this was going on specifically in the agricultural ministry. How do we respond to this, long-term blockade and the restrictions on the import of, fertilizers and pesticides and things like this. So there's this long-term plan drawn up to be able to reduce dependence and on those imported fertilizers and pesticides in return, or encourage, at least, you can't completely do it, but encourage sustainable and organic agriculture. And there's, millions of rain-fed trees like olives and dates that were planted in the former areas where the Israeli settlements used to be. Vast organic composting initiative. There was this one man here that we visited that was really lovely in the north of Gaza that had this small organic farm, and he was trying to encourage people. Then he had a lot of local customers, many of which had all sorts of cancers due to the continued bombing and use of all sorts of chemicals that people were exposed to. So you see this as well taking off. We saw a lot of mushroom farms. They're trying to provide supplemental forms of protein to people that was cheap and affordable. Here you see the mushroom cultivation taking place. Again, more of the women in the cooperative, and here I'll just end with several pictures, and we can take some Q&A. These two brothers were really quite nice. They started Gaza's first inland fish hatchery, and the obvious question is, why would you need a inland freshwater fish hatchery if you live on a coastal territory? Well, of course, it's because of the naval blockade and the inability of fishermen to properly catch anything. And of course, they faced their own struggle. This idea was enthusiastically adopted, by the way, but by a lot of the aid agencies, and really was very successful. And they began to buy the fish from them and would distribute it to other farms as well. And it provided a cheap source of fish for people who couldn't afford to buy whatever was being caught off the sea. But then somebody was asking me yesterday, well, then how do they, first of all, how do they fill it with water, and how do they, oxygenate it? And the water would be like through a well. So then this is in the north of Gaza, where water is a bit more abundant. But again, you would need electricity to power the well, and that's not always available. But when you are able to fill it, you don't need to change the water that often. But then how do you oxygenate it? Well, you don't have, you can't operate the pump around the clocks. So they would say, easy, we just call all the neighborhood kids, and they would splash around in the water and have a great time. And that was that. So it was pretty ingenious, we thought. Yeah. Images of this is what they call khubz saj, or sort of like a griddle bread that's made and then used in various applications. But we have, we talk about the difference between the public face of food, street food versus home food, and what we really wanted to capture was the home scene, but we do have a lot of pictures of the street food as well. Yeah, roast chicken is really spicy. This contraption is called a zibdiya, and it's a mortar and a lemonwood pestle. And this has been fired so that it's quite dark, but ordinarily it's a red clay. And Gaza has a long history of pottery making. And this device is ubiquitous in Gaza. It's used by every household, rich and poor, young and old, and they last for generations. And it has a really rough interior, and it's used to prep ingredients like mashing garlic, but then it's also used as a serving utensil. So you make a really famous spicy tomato salad in it, and then you would serve in it. And you would also make certain stews in it and bake in it. So it's kind of an all-in-one device. It sounds like I'm about to sell it, right? Yeah, you can get it right here. No, I'm kidding, you can't. But we had so many people that spoke so fondly about this. It was really nice. We met this one man who was a former minister of the environment, was kind of an all-around, tinkerer and amateur historian. And he, asked his wife to bring out his zibdiya. And he said, this is like my fourth child, and he hugged it or something. And, and he was explaining all these various things that he made with it. But yeah, anytime you meet a Palestinian from Gaza, you can be sure they have one of these wherever they live around the world. So here we're picking and chopping. Chard is a very common green used extensively throughout Palestinian cuisine. Again, just sort of documentation of what various kitchens look like. And we were having a side conversation earlier on our table about how, we feel like the best food is prepared often, sitting cross-legged on the floor, not in any fancy kitchen. So this is a good example of that. These urns are, some of you might have had the rice tonight with the lamb. That's called idra or gidra in Gaza, and it's a spiced rice with chickpeas and lamb, and it's ordinarily cooked in these clay urns and then placed in a brick oven and cooked over low heat, and then the urn is actually cracked, and you would dispose of the clay and then you would eat it that way. It's really lovely, and it's a ceremonial kind of thing, and it's usually served at weddings or funerals or whatever. There's an assortment of vegetables that are stuffed, and again, this is quite common throughout the Middle East. In Gaza, the specialties, the vegetables that grow very abundantly there are this variety of squash, kusa, and then sweet peppers and eggplants. These are just menaish, or flatbreads topped with cheese and tomatoes and so on. Again, the zibdiya here you see being used to prepare a salad. fish, seafood is again, you'd be hard pressed to find seafood in the West Bank. It's usually frozen or brought in from either maybe Jordan or wherever. But Gaza is really well known for its seafood, and Palestinians in the West Bank used to always ask any Gazan they knew that was coming to bring them fish because it was so hard to find in the West Bank. But the Israelis would never allow it, and they still don't allow it through for anyone who is able to cross. Very few people can. But anyway, and a lot of that heritage beyond obviously the Palestinians of Gaza City itself, a lot of that seafood heritage comes from the Palestinians, the refugees from Jaffa. It was really well known for its seafood heritage. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but kind of Gaza's food can be divided into three separate categories. You have kind of the rural dishes, some of which we sampled tonight, and those would have come from the Palestinian refugees from the interior villages that we saw on the map. And then you have kind of the seafood heritage of Jaffa and Gaza City, and those dishes tend to be more generously spiced. Spices, of course, traditionally having been more expensive. And then you have the I don't even know what the third one is. I had the coast and the city and the rural dishes. But you kind of have a combination of flavors, some more vegetarian, some more dependent on meat and spices. And you have sort of the sparse population of nomadic peoples in Gaza, who this woman sells her own homemade kishik. Right here, I talked about it earlier, and what they are is kind of sun-dried cakes of wheat that's been ground with either, in this case, yogurt, and then flavored with peppers and dill. And then it's sun-dried and it's preserved this way, and then you would dilute it with water and cook it either with lamb or mix it into salads. Just more dishes here, various dishes and peoples. These two flavors figure very prominently in the cuisine as well, dill and cumin. And I guess I'll end there. And again, if you have any more, oh, it really ended there, just kind of dramatically ended. Anyway, if you have any more questions, I'm happy to address them. Yeah, thank you very much.
Aman 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 ya leyl. Aman 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 ya leyl. Aman ya leyl. Aman 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 ya